Revelation that had a symbol that went back to the Old Testament, and so we looked at some of those things in the Old Testament. Sometimes John will see something, and then he's told, "Here's what it is that you're looking at." We saw that back in chapter 17 when he sees the harlot being introduced, and she's arrayed in all this marvelous display. And in verse 7 of chapter 17, John is told, "I'm going to tell you what the mystery is. Here's the mind that has wisdom," and he explains who she is. But in the second half of the book, as we started in chapter 12, we see a summary there in chapter 12 of Satan making war with God. That Satan has basically been making war with God and making war with us since the beginning of time, since going all the way back to the Garden of Eden. But he's tried to make war in heaven. He's tried to make war by wiping out the seed line of David, so that the Messiah wouldn't come. He tried to kill Jesus when he was a child, when he was still 2 years old. Herod tried to kill all the babies at that time, and they had to flee into Egypt. And he's tried to stop Jesus and tried to stop God at every step along the way. And that all of that doesn't work. And so the chapter 12 is sort of this overview of Satan's war. And part of Satan's war is that he's going to go after the church as a whole. When the church gets established, he's going to go after the church as a whole. And in order to do that, he's going to recruit three allies. And we see that beginning in chapter 13, where he gets the sea beast, right? The beast of the sea, which represents Roman governmental power. And we saw that by looking at the symbolism that is there in that particular beast, what its heads look like, what its body looks like. And going back and looking in Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7, we saw similar things there with regards to governmental authority, that there were different kingdoms that were going to come. It was going to start with Babylon, and then you've got the Medes and the Persians, you've got the Greeks, and then finally the Romans, that fourth kingdom that Daniel talks about, that in these days, in the days of those kings, God's going to set up a kingdom that'll never be destroyed. And so Satan's recruited this beast from the sea, the Roman government, to go after Christians, to go after Christianity, to go after the church as a whole. He recruits a second ally, the beast from the earth, that promotes the first beast and promotes the worship of the first beast. And that's sort of the religious power of the Roman Empire, where they are promoting the cult of emperor worship. And that was something that Nero had wanted to be worshiped, but wasn't as full blown maybe as it was going to be later on. Vespasian, who seems to be the emperor when John is writing this, didn't want that sort of thing. But when Domitian comes along, Domitian's going to begin his rule in 81, going to rule until 96. When Domitian comes along, he's going to demand to be worshipped as God. And so you're going to have emperor worship that's going to be commanded to them. And Christians obviously aren't going to be able to partake in that. They're not going to be able to burn incense to the emperor. They're not going to be able to say Caesar is Lord and renounce Jesus. And that's what they're going to be asked to do. And that's why there's going to be a problem. There's going to be persecution that's going to come because of that. And then the third ally that Satan recruits, we were introduced to in chapter 17, is this harlot. And it's all the decadence of Rome is represented by this harlot. And when you think about what it is that leads Christians astray, it's other religions, it's apathy, but it's a lot of times, oh, this is a shiny thing over here. Let's go take a look at that, right? It's the material wealth, it's the material gain, it's the sexual sins, it's all those things that go into that decadence and luxurious living that are going to be a snare for those first century Christians, and something that they need to be aware of, and something that Satan's going to use to try to lead them astray and to try to defeat them. And so this section is dealing with Satan versus the church, and the church needs to stick with God. The church needs to stick with Christ, and individual Christians need to remain faithful, even if it means their physical death, Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10, in order to receive the crown of life. And because the book is a book of victory, that Jesus is going to be victorious and God's going to be victorious. And the Roman Empire, as powerful as it is not going to be victorious. And Satan, as powerful as he may be, he's not going to be victorious in this. And so they are going to fail. And so we were talking about the fall of the harlot. They cut, the three allies come up: the beast of the sea, the beast from the earth, and then the harlot, and then they sort of fall in reverse order. So the harlot falls first, or the fall of the harlot is described to us first, and then we're going to get the beast from the earth and the beast from the sea are going to be defeated in chapter 19. But this has to do with things that are shortly to come to pass. That's what John said, and that's what John was told at the very beginning of the book of Revelation, that these things are at hand, the time is about to come to pass. And so at the end of the book, he's told not to seal up the words of this book, for the time is at hand, the time is nearby when these things are going to take place. Because he's writing this probably somewhere in the late 70s AD, and these things are going to start to take place in the third century. There's going to be a crisis in Rome. In the third century, in the 200s, there's going to be 40 years or 50 years of tumult within the Roman Empire. They're going to survive that. But when we get over into the 300s, late 300s, and into the 400s, the Roman Empire is going down, and there's nothing that's going to save it at that point. But we'll pick up here in verse 9, which is sort of where we left off in Revelation chapter 18. Any comments or questions about any of these things as we sort of get back to where we were last week? I know for those of you that are visiting, you're sort of getting dumped in the middle of it, but if you want to see the other lessons, they're available on our YouTube channel. Beginning here in verse 9, it says, "The kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning." This is talking about the harlot, that she's being judged. Judgment has come. Destruction is coming for her. She's not going to have all those rich things that she had before. And so the kings of the earth who were involved with her, right, those client kings who received authority and they received power and they received authority and they received luxury, they are those that are guilty with her because they've been going along with what it is that she's been promoting. And so they lived luxurious with her. It says they will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning. Standing at a distance, it says in verse 10, for fear of her torment, saying, "Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come." So here you've got the kings of the earth, those client kings, those folks that had received power or authority from Rome to rule with her. They are going to weep and lament. Now it says they'll weep and lament for her, but it's more along the lines of them weeping and lamenting for themselves, because their power is going to be gone, their authority is going to be gone, all those luxuries that they enjoyed are going to be gone, and so they have achieved power and wealth and position by being aligned with Rome, and now all of that is going to be gone. And so they're going to weep and lament, it says. There's two different words that are used there. When we think of weeping and lamenting, sometimes, you might get a little tear in your eye sometimes, or you might. I remember when my grandfather passed, and they did the military thing at the funeral, and they did the 21 gun salute, and I remember looking at my cousins, and we all sort of broke down right at that point. Um, but this is sort of like the Mediterranean style of weeping and lamenting, if you will. It's very vocal, it's very demonstrative. And so it's that sort of idea that they are weeping and lamenting when they see the smoke of her burning. And they stand, it says, at a distance for fear of her torment. They stand at a distance. It's almost like these client kings no longer want to be associated with Rome, right? That Rome's being defeated, Rome's being overrun, the barbarians are going to come in and they're going to take, but all these things are happening. The city's on fire, and they're going to want to distance themselves from that because they don't want anybody to take it out on them, if you will. They don't want the enemies to take it out on them, and so they're standing at a distance for fear of her torment. So they sort of no longer want to be associated with her. Almost like the idea that when the barbarians come in, well, I wasn't really ever associated with Rome. I was just sort of a citizen. I just sort of happened to be here. It's sort of like in World War II, where folks would say, "Oh, I wasn't involved with the Vichy government in France, right? I wasn't one of those collaborators with the Nazis. I was in the resistance." If everyone in France that claimed to have been in the resistance was in the resistance in World War II, the Germans maybe never would have taken France in the first place. But where are all of her friends gone now, right? That she has been defeated, she's been burned up, she's being judged, she's being destroyed, and all of those that uh, she had put into power are standing at a distance and distancing themselves from Rome. And it says that, alas, alas, that great city of Babylon. Here, Babylon is used to describe the city that's ruling. The city that's ruling in the time of John is not Babylon, but Babylon was the beginning of all of that, right? When Nebuchadnezzar had his dream and when Daniel had his vision in Daniel chapter 7, Babylon was the beginning of that uh, reign of kingdoms, those successive kingdoms that were going to come. And so Babylon is the head of gold, if you will, in Nebuchadnezzar's dream and that statue that he saw. And so it all begins with Babylon. And so he's using Babylon. And again, I mentioned this before, but if they had been carrying a book with them that clearly was written in everyday language that people could read and understand clearly, and it said that Rome was going to be overthrown and the Christians were going to be victorious, they were already being persecuted by Rome. It would have been much worse if they had a book that clearly spelled that out. And so this book is written in apocalyptic language. It's written in this way so that the Christians would read it and they'd understand. Okay, we're not really talking about Babylon. We're talking about that ruling city, right? The city that rules over the kings. And at the very last verse of chapter 17, sort of identifies that identifies that harlot for us as being the city of Rome. It talks about how she sits on seven hills, or it's a city that's on seven hills, and Rome was a city that was built on seven hills. And so we're not really talking about Babylon. Babylon here is being used to represent Rome, the mighty city, because in its heyday, at its peak, Rome looked like it couldn't be beaten. Looked like there's no way Rome could be beaten. And so that great city, that mighty city. Earlier it had said in one day the judgment had come. Now it says for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And it's not that this happens immediately, right? As soon as John finishes writing this, that Rome falls. There's going to be a process that God's going to be patient with them. He's going to give them time to repent. But when the end comes, it's gonna happen sort of quickly when the end does come. Verse 11, it says, "And the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. Merchandise of gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple, silk and scarlet, every kind of citron wood, every kind of object of ivory, every kind of object of most precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble, and cinnamon and incense, fragrant oil and frankincense, wine and oil, fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and bodies and souls of men." There isn't going to be any place for any of these luxurious items, for any of this magnificent wealth. There isn't going to be any place for that anymore. Because when your empire has been destroyed, when you've been overrun by barbarians, when you don't have anything anymore because everything has been taken from you, your primary focus is going to be on, okay, can I get food and can I get water? You're not going to be thinking about, can I have, the nicest clothes in scarlet and purple because those were expensive dyes in order to get that particular color. You're not going to be thinking about, well, can I get my jewelry on, right? And my precious stones and my pearls and all of that. There's not going to be any concern for any of that. And so the merchants, right, in addition to the kings of the earth, we have a second group here. The merchants of the earth are going to weep and mourn for her. They join in. They're going to again weep and mourn. So you've got the same two words that are used here that were used for the kings. Again, uh, uh, very obvious mourning over what has taken place. And they're more. It says they're mourning over her, but why are they really mourning? It says, "For no one buys their merchandise anymore." So they're not really concerned that Rome has fallen. They're not really concerned about people. They're not really concerned about the government. What they're concerned about, what they're weeping and mourning over, is that no one buys their merchandise anymore. They have lost all their customers, right? And so they've lost their means of wealth. And so no one buys their merchandise, or I think some translations might say no one buys their cargoes anymore. And so it's financial loss, not the esteem for the city that prompts their distress. And so they're not really concerned maybe that Rome has fallen. They're just concerned that they have lost their income. And so John gives a list of all these things for which there are no longer buyers, right? You're not going to be concerned with gold and silver if you're just worried about scrounging out a living. You're not going to be worried about ivory and precious wood, bronze and iron and marble, and even those you'd say maybe luxury food items, cinnamon, incense, fragrant oil, frankincense, wine and oil. You're not going to be worried about it. Cattle and sheep, right? You're not going to be able to afford to buy cattle and sheep, or horses and chariots. And then bodies and souls of men. The Bible oftentimes will talk about our body and our soul, or our body and our spirit, or our body and our soul and our spirit being different things. Here he's got the two of them are listed together, bodies and souls. And a lot of times when we think about this, when we think about who it is that we are, and because we live in a physical world and we have a physical being, we tend to think that this body is who we are. But who we are is what's inside. Who we are is that soul. A lot of times we think in terms of we are a body and we have a soul, but really we are a soul and we have a body. We have this tent, we have this house that we live in. Someday we're going to move out of. And so the two are listed here separately, bodies and souls. Well, what's he talking about? That no one's buying the bodies and souls of men. Slave traders are going to have nowhere now to sell their slaves. Because in some cases, the people that they were capturing and selling as slaves, now those are the barbarians that are coming in that are now going to be in charge. Right? They're the ones that are going to overrun the Roman Empire. And so the slave traders are going to have nowhere to sell their slaves. Slavery was a big business in the Roman Empire. Slaves, there's estimates that 10 to 20%, 10 to 20% of the population of Rome were slaves. That's 1 in every 10, or 2 in every 10, 1 in every 5 were slaves. It would equal 5 to 10 million people at the height of the Roman Empire that were slaves. Didn't have either they were sold into slavery because they couldn't pay a debt, or they were captured and made slaves. And so they're lamenting because they're not going to be able to do these things anymore. They're not going to be able to enjoy all of this luxury anymore. Verse 14, it says, the fruit that your soul longed for has gone from you, and all the things which are rich and splendid have gone from you, and you shall find them no more at all. So it's not just, well, this is going to be temporary, like earlier when we had the blowing of the trumpets, there was a third of this and a third of that, right? And it wasn't everything. But now it's going to be gone. And it's not just gone for a little period of time. It's not just gone for this 40 or 50 years of tumult. Now it's going to be gone, and it's going to be sort of gone forever, right? That's sort of the idea, that all of these things. And so the city is addressed directly here, informed that her luxuries are things of the past. The fruit that she longed for is gone. The riches, the oily or the fat things are luxuries. The splendor, the splendid things, exotic foodstuffs, and clothing and decorative objects. People are no longer going to find them in the great city. They're no longer going to be able to find those things available in Rome, even if you had the money to buy them. The wealth of Rome, which clearly lies behind this passage, was proverbial. Sometimes the Talmud would say, the ancient people would say that, well, there were 10 units of wealth that God put on the earth, and Rome took 9 of those, and the 10th one was divided amongst the rest of the world. That they were very rich compared to the rest of the world around them. Does that sound familiar to you at all? A nation that has majority of the wealth in the world, the majority of the luxuries in the world, and that thinks that there's no one that can touch them, that they're powerful and nothing's going to bring them down. God's the one who's in control, and that's sort of what he's getting at here in Revelation, is that God's the one that's in control. And he has allowed Rome to do what Rome does because he's allowed man to have free will. So he's allowed Rome to do what Rome does, but at some point there's a judgment that is going to come for all of these things. And this is a time that judgment is coming to them, because of what it is that they've done, because of her great fornication, because she's caused other nations to partake in her fornication and all the things that she's done, and in the killing of the saints. And we'll see that as we go on. Verse 15, the merchants of these things who became rich by her will stand at a distance for fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, and saying, alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. It's those who have a vested interest in the city who bewail her passing. It's the passing of their prophets, right? You've got the kings, now you've got the merchants. Just like the kings, they don't approach to help or to offer comfort, but they stand at a distance. right? They stand at a distance and they weep and wail. And if you remember in chapter 17, that was how the harlot was described to John, or how he saw her when he first saw her, that she was riding a scarlet beast, and she was arrayed how? In purple and in scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, and carrying that golden chalice. And so that description here is still the same description, right? She was adorned in that way. She was luxurious, maybe beautiful to behold, if you will, but inside full of filth and abominations. Any comments or questions on any of these things? And so a lot of times when disaster strikes, when there's natural calamities that come, as we've looked at with the blowing of the trumpets and the pouring out of the bowls, when there's internal decadence and there's foreign invasion that comes, it's the wealth that's going to get dried up, right? And that's the first thing that's going to happen, is the wealth is going to get dried up, and you're not going to have those luxury items anymore. It's sort of the beginning of the end, if you will. It says in verse 17, "For in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing. Every shipmaster, all who travel by sea, sailors, and as many as trade on the sea, stood at a distance and cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, 'What is like this great city?' They threw dust on their heads and cried out, weeping and wailing, and saying, 'Alas, alas, that great city, in which all who had ships on the sea became rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she is made desolate.'" So you got a third group here. So you got the kings of the earth, right? They've been made powerful and been given authority by Rome, and now that's gone. And so they're weeping and wailing for themselves. You got the merchants who became rich over trading things with her, with Rome, and now they're no longer, no one's going to buy their stuff anymore. They're weeping and wailing, and they're keeping their distance. And now you've got a third group. You've got shipmasters and sailors, those who trade on the sea. Uh, they're standing at a distance as well. The suddenness and the completeness of Rome's destruction strikes them. Good morning. We're in Revelation chapter 18. And so even though the city had great wealth, it's all been brought to ruin. In the loss of the wealth, there's not any care for the people. There's not any care for that, but what concerns the merchants is their loss of business. That whether they bring it in on the sea, or whether they bring it in some other way, whatever it is that they have, that all of those things have come to an end. There in verse 17, notice it says again, "For in 1 hour," right? We saw in one day and in 1 hour, and now again in 1 hour, this happened over a period of time, but in the end, it happened fairly quickly. Can we trust in riches? Can we trust in the material things of this world? Why not? We're going to lose it all, right? How are we going to lose it? Can't take it with us, right? We're going to pass from this world. We can't bring it with us. You never see a hearse towing a U-Haul, right? That'd be weird, wouldn't it? I mean, the pharaohs maybe thought they could take it with them. They buried their stuff, in the pyramids. That's why their crypts were so big. They're putting all their stuff in there. But you can't take it with you when you go, right? We're going to die. But even if we don't die, what's going to happen when Jesus comes back? We're going to go be with God, but what's going to happen to all the stuff that's here? It's all going to be burned. It's all going to burn up, right? It's all going to melt with fervent heat, is what Peter says. So all riches one day are going to come to nothing. They're not here for the long haul, right? It's why we can't trust in them. It's why we can't rely upon them. It's why we can't make that our end goal. If our end goal is to just get as much stuff and as much material wealth as we possibly can, right? You've seen those little bumper stickers, "Whoever dies with the most toys wins." There's another bumper sticker that says, "Whoever dies with the most toys still dies," right? It's not about chasing after material things and putting your hopes into those things. But that's the snare that wealth brings. That's the snare that luxury brings. That's the snare that Rome's decadence brought. is that people thought, well, we got all this stuff, we've got all this wealth, we're set for life, right? We don't need anything. We don't need anything that God has. Maybe that's why sometimes it's easier to convert people in poor countries, because they're looking for something better than what it is that they have now. Rich folks, they tend to think that they've got everything that they need. And when we talk about rich folks, we're not talking about Bill Gates and Elon Musk or Warren Buffett, right? We're talking about all of us. We got running water in our house. We have plumbing in our house. Unless you're from West Virginia, I guess you have plumbing in your house. My wife was from West Virginia. We're richer than most of the people that are in the world, right? We don't have a dirt floor in our house. We've actually got carpet or hardwood floors or luxurious items, right? Marble countertops. We're the rich folks. We got to be careful of not putting our faith in those things and understanding that we need God and we need what God has. Because all of that in Rome is going to be gone. And that's what John is being shown here in Revelation chapter 18. And so these shipmasters, these that trade on the sea, they're standing at a distance. Again, they're not wanting to be associated, right? They've secured their livelihoods from the activities of the great city. And because of that, they lament her passing because all of that is gone. But like the groups previously mentioned, they stand far off. No one stretches out a hand to help. The great city has brought profit to many, but affection to none. So in verse 18, they cry out when they see the smoke of her burning, saying, "What is like this great city?" What is like Rome? Well, go back to chapter 13 and verse 7. When the beast of the sea was first introduced to us, what is like the beast? Who is like the beast? Who can make war with him? Who can deal with him? And individual Christians were not going to be able to go and overthrow the Roman Empire. That was never going to happen, right? Because it looks strong, looks mighty, looks undefeatable. And that's what they're saying now, is that I can't believe Rome fell. Right? What is like this great city? Their first, the point that they make here in their dirge is the incomparableness of the great city. Nothing was like her. But even though nothing was like her, come over to Ezekiel chapter 27 for a moment. In Ezekiel chapter 27 and verse 32, it's talking about the fall of Tyre. Now, God, through the prophets, had talked about these different groups of people, that they were doing things that were wrong, and because of that, they were going to be judged. And those various different nations, those various different cities, were going to be judged over the course of time. And so you've got these judgments in time that take place against nations, against cities, against peoples, because of what it is that they've done. And this judgment against Rome is just another one of those judgments in time, like what we see in the Old Testament. In Ezekiel chapter 27 and verse 32, it says, "In their wailing for you, they will take up a lamentation and lament for you. What city is like Tyre, destroyed in the midst of the sea?" What city is like Tyre? What nation, what empire is like Babylon? Right? What is like Rome? What is like Washington, D.C.? You might think that some of these things are indefeatable, but if God's not on their side, it doesn't matter how great and mighty we think we are in our own material things. And sometimes you wonder, does history repeat itself? You know, you've got how great is Tyre, right? Look at this great city. What city is like Tyre? You got the downfall of Tyre, you got the downfall of Babylon, you got the downfall of Persia, now you got the downfall of Rome. In the book of Judges, right? They repeat that historical cycle over and over and over again. Are we as human beings doomed to repeat history because we don't learn from it? One historian said those who don't understand history, or those who don't know history, are doomed to repeat it. And I don't know if that means that you're just going to flunk the class and you're going to have to take it again. But we seem to be doomed sometimes to repeat that history.
It makes sense because this is a follow. In other words, it makes bad sense in a sense,
Yeah.
what you just said.
It's almost like Satan's playing a broken record, right? because he's using the same things. He's using the same methods, right, to entice people through pride or through other things, through those shiny little baubles, right, to come look over here and to wander away from God. And he's using those same things over and over again, and mankind is falling for it over and over again. Comments or questions on any of these things? These folks, at least is what we get here, they go maybe a little bit further in their wailing. In verse 19, they threw dust on their heads and cried out, weeping and wailing. And same words used there for weeping and wailing that were used for the other groups. But the dust on the heads, that was something that was done in old times when you were mourning or in mourning for something, that you would put dust on your head or ashes on your head, or that you'd clothe yourself in sackcloth to sort of show that you were in a period of mourning. And so they threw dust on their heads and they're weeping and wailing, alas, alas, the great city in which all who had ships on the sea became rich by her wealth. And so the sailors seem to carry their mourning further maybe than the other groups, in that they throw the dust on their heads. Back in Ezekiel 27, you'll see that as well. Go back a couple verses earlier than where we were before. In verse 30, it says, they will make their voice heard because of you. They will cry bitterly and cast dust on their heads. They will roll about in ashes. And so it's that sort of idea that you're not really concerned about your physical appearance, right? That you're putting dust on your heads or you're putting dirt on your heads. And so they're crying out and they're wailing and they're mourning. And so the third time we see these two verbs being used with these groups of people that are mourning this. It says, for in 1 hour, right? In 1 hour, she is made desolate or has been laid waste, literally. And so the suddenness of it all is expressed in this phrase, in 1 hour. It's almost like we can't believe that this would have happened, right? Not that maybe didn't notice that, well, Rome's been in decline for a long time. But when the end comes, when the end of their wealth comes, it's like they weren't looking for it. They weren't expecting it, right? They were expecting that they were going to pull through this again. So in verse 20, it says, rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. Sometimes the call to rejoice over these things might cause people to wonder, are we rejoicing over the downfall of those who are evil? It's not a vindictive outcry so much as it is a longing that justice be done. Those souls that were crying underneath the altar in chapter 6, wanting to know how long before you avenge us on those who took our lives. They want to know, when is God going to execute judgment? And certainly when we look around in our world and we see things that are going on that are evil, that are unjust, that are just terrible things to behold, what mankind does to mankind, we may wonder sometimes, God, when are you going to fix this? God, when are you going to execute justice? God, why do you allow good people to suffer, but you're not punishing these bad people in the world, right? We may sometimes wonder, well, when is God's going to execute judgment at some point.
In his own time.
In his own time, right? In his own time. God is patient, right? God is long suffering towards us, not willing that any should repent, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance, right? It's 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9. God's long suffering and he's patient. And he's long suffering and he's patient with these evil people. Not just long suffering and patient with us. He's long suffering and patient with them. He's long suffering and patient with Rome, in giving them the natural calamities that were going to come through the trumpets in chapter 9, and the 1/3 of this and 1/3 of that's going to be affected. And you read in chapter 9, what was the purpose of all of that? Because he wanted them to repent. He says, nevertheless, they did not repent and turn to him. Right? He's trying to get their attention through natural calamities and the things that are going to come upon them because of the evils of their sin and the ugliness of their sin, and maybe the diseases that are going to come with that. Foreign invasion, right? Defeat on the battlefield that's going to take place, is to try to get their attention to say, hey, you need to turn to God, because if God's not on your side, you're not in it for the long haul. You're not going to make it if God's not with you. But God allows them to go. He allows them to go. And we talked about this wine vat terminology that's used in the Bible, and we're going to see this when we get to chapter 19 especially. But God allows their sins to build, and he allows them to build, and he allows them to build like a wine vat that's getting full of grapes. And when the wine vat gets full of grapes, then you get in and you trample out the grapes and you make grape juice, right? It's when it gets full. And so that every nation sort of has their own wine vat. And their sins go in that wine vat. And when that wine vat gets full, God gets in there, and it appears that it's Jesus is the one who gets in there, and he tramples out the grapes of that nation. He tramples them out in his wrath. And he's going to be shown in chapter 19 to be one whose robe is stained with blood as if he had been trampling the wine vat, because that's what he's been doing. He's going to trample out Rome's wine vat because now it's gotten to a point where it's like God says, okay, that's it. I'm no longer going to, his patience is going to wear out, right? He's long suffering and he's patient, but there's a time where that's going to end.
God in patience, he requires surrender. That's why he's so patient. He wants them to surrender to him.
Yeah. Yeah. He wants them to surrender to him. He wants them to, right? He's loving. And so he gives us as much time as he can. And so this isn't some sort of vindictive, yeah, you know, God's getting them kind of thing. But the rejoicing is that justice has been done, because John and his readers are not sort of like sitting in some academic hall having a debate or a discussion on ethics as to, you know, whether or not we should rejoice over the downfall of evil people. They had skin in the game, right? They were being persecuted. They were being killed by the Roman Empire. John was in prison because of the Roman Empire, because of his faith, because of the testimony of Jesus Christ. And so they were committed to what was going on. They had bet everything on God in the situation that they were in, because it would have been so much easier in a physical sense to just say, all right, I'm going to burn a little incense. I'm just going to admit, I'm going to say Caesar is Lord, even though I don't believe it, just so that I don't have to face the persecution. So it would have been very easy in a physical sense in that moment to turn the back on God. But they had bet everything on staying faithful to God, staying faithful to death, even if they lost their physical lives. And so why are they to rejoice? Because God's justice is going to be executed. Comments or questions on these things?
So it's either surrender to Caesar or surrender to God.
Those are your choices, yeah. And those are sort of our choices today. Not that I'm saying that you can't be patriotic towards your country or anything like that. But our choices today are you can surrender to Satan, right, and be a slave of sin, or you can surrender to God and be a slave of righteousness. But there's no middle path, right? There's no middle group. When Jesus talks about there being two paths, he says there's two paths. When Jesus separates the sheep from the goats, there's two places. One is heaven, one's hell, right? There's no third place, right? There's no intermediary place. We got this life to make our choice and to set our priorities for what it is that they need to be. Verse 21 and following says, "Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, Thus with violence the great city Babylon shall be thrown down and shall not be found any more. The sound of harpists, musicians, flutists, and trumpeters shall not be heard in you any more. No craftsman of any craft shall be found in you any more. And the sound of a millstone shall not be heard in you any more. The light of a lamp shall not shine in you any more. And the voice of the bridegroom and the bride shall not be heard in you any more. For your merchants were the great men of the earth, for by your sorcery all the nations were deceived. And in her was found the blood of the prophets and saints and of all who were slain on the earth." There's a finality, if you will, to the downfall of Rome, that when Rome falls, it's not coming back as an empire again. Just like when Babylon fell, it did not come back as an empire. When Persia fell, it did not come back. When Greece fell, those empires have never come back. God said they weren't going to. And so the idea here is that you've got this vision, this angel taking up this great millstone and throwing it into the sea. Well, if you threw this great big heavy stone into the sea and it went down into the depths of the sea, who was ever going to see that stone again? No one is, right? If it's down in the depths of the sea, no one's going to see that stone again. It's gone forever. And so, again, this is an indication that there's going to be complete destruction here. It's not just going to be sort of partial. It's going to be complete destruction that's going to come. Rome's going to be gone and is not going to rise again. Just like that great stone thrown in the depths of the sea wouldn't be seen again by man. Isn't this what God said was going to happen? Go back to Daniel chapter 2 for a moment. Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. He dreams of this statue that he sees. And it's got a head of gold, and it's got the shoulders of silver, and it's got the midsection of bronze, and it's got legs that are made of iron, and there's miry clay that are mixed in with the legs and the feet there with it. And Nebuchadnezzar sees the stone that's cut without hands, then the stone strikes the statue, and the statue is destroyed. And he wants to know what this dream is about. And so he asks his wise men, saying, tell me what the dream was that I had, and then tell me the interpretation. And his wise men and his magicians, they say, well, we can't, no one can tell you, what your dream was. But you tell us the dream and we'll tell you what it means. And Nebuchadnezzar, I think, is sort of wise to their shenanigans at this point. He knows that if he tells them what the dream is, they're just going to make something up. And so he says, no, you're going to tell me the dream first, and then you're going to tell me the interpretation so that I know that you're authentic. And so they go and they get Daniel, and Daniel comes, and it's not because Daniel is anybody special, but Daniel speaks to God, and God speaks to him, and God's going to reveal to Daniel what's going on in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And so as he's telling him about this, as God tells Daniel this, and Daniel's relaying this back to Nebuchadnezzar, he's telling him about his dream here in Daniel chapter 2, and notice verses 34 and 35. Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, you watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them into pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. You see, when Babylon fell, the Persians borrowed some of the things from the Babylonians. They inherited that and they kind of carried it on. When the Greeks come along, they sort of borrow things from the Persians, and they rule over the same amount of territory, right? And they said they rule over the same group of people. And so they sort of inherit some of those things and they carry it on. It's left to other people. The empire, the kingdom is left to other people. When the Romans come along, they do the same thing. They borrow from everybody else. They're great copiers. But they're all going to be destroyed. All four of them. They're all going to be blown away like the chaff from the wind. They're not going to be found anymore. And that's the same thing that John's being shown over here in Revelation, is that with the Roman Empire, with that fourth empire, that it's going away and it isn't coming back again. It's not going to be found anymore. Any last minute comments or questions or snide remarks before we break for worship? I hope this helps in understanding what's going on in the book and deciphering some of the symbolism that is there. It was meant for them to be understood, and I think it's meant for us to be understood as well. Just maybe take some time to work our way through these things. I appreciate your attention and your comments. Thank you.